Hello and welcome to this webinar from ANROS on how we value practitioners' expertise in the research. I'm Tessa Boyd-Kane. I'm CEO here at Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, and I'm really delighted to welcome you and our panellists to this really important discussion. I'm joining from unceded Gadigal lands where our Sydney office is based, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I recognise the critical importance of centring and supporting First Nations leadership in the evidence to drive change as we work towards ending domestic, family and sexual violence. I was born and grew up, and I now live, work and play on Gadigal lands, and I feel really privileged to be the beneficiary of the continuing care of country and of community in this place that has always been a meeting place, and recognising that Gadigal have provided that leadership and that continuing care and commitment over generations. I joined ANROS in February last year with a long-standing passion for helping to connect research, policy and practice to make progress on the social challenges that we face. And so I feel really privileged to be able to bring that commitment to ANROS at this point in our role and contribution. And that's partly because of the critical role of evidence in driving change to end domestic, family and sexual violence. And it's partly because organisations like ours need to play such an active role in decolonising practices like research and in building and sustaining community trust and confidence in the evidence to drive change. I think today's webinar really reflects and continues that commitment. We have a terrific range of perspectives and expertise across this panel, as well as people joining us online for the discussion. We have set aside time after our panel discussion for a live Q&A, so please send through your questions at any time by clicking the Q&A button that's located at the top of your screen, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as we can. Your wellbeing is really important to us and in this work, and it's something that we pay a lot of attention to at ANROS, how we take care of ourselves to sustain the work and the impact. And so that includes the context of any sort of discussion, including the one that we might have today, and how you reflect on those ideas in the days to come. This webinar is being recorded, so if you do need to step away or just take some time out from the session, you'll have a chance to catch up on that later. We're also providing some information on support services in the chat now. And as we think about how we sustain our wellbeing in this work, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the lived expertise of many different parts of this story in the conversation that we're having today, amongst those of us doing the work, amongst those of us showing up to listen and participate in the discussion, and reflected right across the system that we work in as part of the combined effort to end violence against women and children in particular. In 2022, the federal government launched a new national plan with the commitment to end violence against women and children in a single generation. ANROS was established as a partner to the first national plan, and we play a really critical role in supporting the evidence to drive the change that the national plan calls for. As part of that role, we developed the Australian National Research Agenda to end violence against women and children, and the current agenda is a 5-year plan to 2028. It's a national framework identifying what evidence is needed to end domestic, family and sexual violence, and critically, how that evidence should be created. The National Research Agenda was co-designed with victim survivors, researchers and practitioners, and it aims to help researchers, practitioners, lived experience experts, policymakers and funders all ensure that their work is organised, purposeful and effective. The National Research Agenda identifies 9 priority areas of research, and you can see these in the middle of the diagram we're showing now. These are the areas where new evidence is sorely needed to help end domestic, family and sexual violence. But as I mentioned, the agenda is also about the how. It's not just what research we do, it's how we do it. And the National Research Agenda asks us to reflect on our approaches to the research in this space, with 6 reflective prompts that are really about the ways of working and the ways of knowing that we see as critical to ensuring that the evidence itself is the right evidence for the right time in terms of the change called for in the national plan. So these ways of working and ways of knowing are about making better use of existing data, about understanding and centering Indigenous methodologies in the research, valuing practitioner expertise, listening to children when they are children, working with the knowledge of experts by experience, and creating space for pilots and evaluations of community-led interventions. This webinar today is the third instalment of a series that we're running to explore these different ways of working and of knowing. The first two webinar recordings are available on the ANRO's website. And this series is part of how we're supporting people in the research space and encouraging people to use the National Research Agenda and to guide research to ensure that, in addition to the findings of that research, the evidence landscape itself is part of the change that we need to see in this work. So today's webinar is focused on valuing practitioner expertise. In that National Research Agenda, we describe practitioners' expertise as essential in all phases of domestic family sexual violence research and evaluation. Practitioner expertise goes beyond frontline service roles. It can include police, courts, housing and education, people working in finance and other services that intersect with victims and survivors, and with people who use domestic family or sexual violence. We see that practitioners bring deep, real-world knowledge that can strengthen research design, can shape measurable outcomes, and can highlight ethical and other considerations. We also see that practitioners play a key role in the broader ecosystem. And when we think about this work through a systems lens, it gives us a way to start unpacking different perspectives and experiences. For instance, around power, the role that it plays in the research that gets done, the questions that are asked, the participant insights that are centred in that work, and the way that research is taken up and put into practice and to drive policy and attitudinal change. We have with us a terrific panel who are going to explore these issues for us today. Our panellists' bios can be accessed via the link that we're sharing on the screens now. And I'm going to try and keep introductions to a minimum to really give them as much time as we can to hear from them directly. So introducing our panel, we're joined by Brodie Evans, who specialises in interventions with persons using violence, and they lead a team as the Program Manager for Behaviour Change Intervention at YFS Limited, delivering behaviour change group programs. Brodie's pronouns are they and them, and we'll be hearing from Brodie shortly in the discussion. Delighted to welcome also Karen Isles, whose pronouns are she, her, who's the Director and Principal Solicitor at Violet Co Legal and Consulting. Karen's practice focuses on workplace law and corporate governance, and Karen is increasingly recognised for her expertise in representing victim survivors of sexual assault and her law reform advocacy in this area. Karen is a Darug Aboriginal woman. We're also joined by Miranda Moir, an accredited mental health social worker who's been practicing for over 20 years with a focus on working with adult and child victim survivors of violence and people who use violence. And last but absolutely not least, Dr. Skye Trudgett, whose pronouns are she, her, who's a Gamilaroi woman who leads COA collaboration with a passion for empowering First Nations communities through evaluation and research. Now, this incredible panel has been coming together over the past couple of weeks in preparation for this webinar, and we've worked through a process to set our approach to the discussion. So I'm just going to clue all of our participants into that process. We want this to be a conversation. I'll facilitate lightly and I'll guide the discussion through the key points that the panellists have identified. We're discussing complex issues, and we recognise that any kind of conversation about complexity has to bring different ways of looking at and approaching the issues for discussion. So we really welcome different perspectives across our panel, and we've worked to develop some rapport and understanding between panellists and to be able to approach the issues in focus with differences of view, respectfully, and recognising that today's discussion is really to support learning. We're not looking for agreement or for one view, and so we respect that across the panel and also in terms of the kinds of questions that you might want to ask. And we're really aiming to provide our audience with shareable, practical examples of what good looks like, while respecting the confidentiality of the people, communities and organisations we'll be talking about. So there may be times when we don't give a level of detail that you're burning to ask about. Take it from us that we're being advised in how we share the insights that this panel has learned across a breadth of experience, while also being careful and respectful of the people that we've learned those insights with. So that's enough from me. I'm going to move us into the discussion. And I really want to set the scene by inviting panellists to share their reflections about the value for evaluation and research in centering practice expertise in evaluation and research, particularly looking at domestic, family and sexual violence. So we're interested in why this is important and what difference it makes. Karen, I'd love to come to you first of all to hear your reflections.
Gosh, thank you very much, Tessa. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Awabakal people here in Newcastle today, and just pay my respects to the immense expertise, knowledge, and wisdom that elders and ancestors have had over many generations in the area of violence against women and gender-based violence generally. I think my kind of reflections, really at a high level to open with, is the opportunity for university-based or consultancies that focus specifically on research and evaluation to partner. And there's so much scope to, in that initial phase, Tessa just spoke about the phase of research design, to be really reaching out to practitioners on day one where you're considering a project and actually bringing practitioners into the field of research at that point. And I think it can only strengthen research outcomes. And really, why are we doing research? We're doing research to change the system. And certainly I think practitioners can play an incredible, and do day to day, an incredible role in systems change. So I think that's my high level reflection, is the opportunity for partnerships.
Thanks, Karen. Miranda, let's throw to you next. Interested in your reflections about why this matters.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa. And I just wanted to also acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Tharawal speaking people this morning, and just wanted to pay my respects to the Tharawal ancestors and elders. I have the privilege of working, living and raising my beautiful son on this land, and recognise the privilege that is, and the cost that has come to the Tharawal speaking people of me now inhabiting this land. Yeah, I mean, certainly building from Karen's point there, I kind of see the value in both kind of like a micro level, and then also a macro level. And so kind of at that micro level, similar to Karen's point, like really the value that practitioners can bring across the entire kind of trajectory of a piece of research, from kind of inception, and like, are we even asking the right kind of question to kind of understand a piece of work, all the way through to kind of that sense-making piece, what's coming out the other side, and how are we going to translate that into a way that the research is actually going to hit the ground and make a difference. But certainly that analysis piece, and I think that there's a lot more kind of opportunity there to bring practitioners into kind of the sense-making process. And also that value, and I think we can probably talk a bit more about this a bit later, but the value of practitioners, particularly in qualitative research, in engaging with research participants in a way that's actually really upholding dignity and really attending to ethics. At a kind of a more macro level, I think that there's real value in kind of tipping the scales a little bit in terms of power. And, you know, there's those patriarchal and kind of colonized structures that have kind of existed in that space of research, that we have the opportunity, and there has been, you know, some fantastic work, you know, every day occurring in this space to really disrupt those structures. And so, you know, I think it's really important, particularly in this space of research, that recognising that those kind of structures, patriarchal and colonised structures and constructs that have led to epistemic kind of injustice are those same structures and constructs that have created and sustained gendered-based violence and racialised violence as well. And so, any efforts that we can do to kind of disrupt the status quo and those power imbalances, I think all chip into me making a difference. I come from, you know, a social work background, and certainly that's very much a female orientated workforce. And so, you know, I think that there is a lot to be said around the undervaluing of practitioner expertise from kind of a gendered perspective as well. And so, you know, I think it's just a real invitation to kind of think about, like, how do we actually attend to power at all of those different levels, whether it be like systematic or kind of at that more micro level as well.
Thanks, Miranda. Brodie, I'd love to come to you. What difference do you think it can make when we bring and centre practice expertise in our evaluation and research?
Sure. I mean, I think my experience with, you know, I've seen evaluations that are government commissioned and going out to universities and seeing how that flows, and I've seen and heard from research where it is practitioner led or co-designed, and I mean, it makes such a big difference when you are actually framing up the parameters of the research and the, you know, what questions we're asking, and what we're actually looking for when it is people that are on the ground that are going to, you know, actually help you get that data. So if you're wanting to do quant research, for example, quantitative research, and as a practitioner, you're able to say, we don't capture that data. We're not going to be able to run a report. We're not going to be able to get that data for you. Or I get you want to do qualitative interviews. The best time would be when we have this interview with the participants, a review or an exit, before he disengages or whatnot. So being able to actually give that practical advice that would shape research design so it can actually be achievable, and that you're going to actually get the data that you want. But also because it shapes kind of, yeah, what we are looking at, the purpose of research, because on the ground, if it's being driven by practitioners, it might be the case that we're seeing something that's working really well. We're seeing, we might be seeing, you know, I'm in the behaviour change space, so seeing light bulb moments and seeing the behaviour change that we're seeing, or outcomes for the program, and then going, but I wonder if do the participants know this, or is this even measurable? And to be able to actually say, well, this is what we want to find out. We want to actually see is what we're seeing actually happening? Is it measurable? And you know, telling the researchers, can you investigate this? Can you get something out of what we're seeing, and have it written and do something with it? That's going to be a very different project than a government commissioned research that's just, does this program work, and a really blunt measurement, and things like that. So I think there's real value in making sure that the people that it's going to impact, the actual people delivering programs and the participants that we work with, that they're actually driving the objectives of the research questions that we're asking, and also because we're often going to be the ones that do a lot of the strategic advocacy that come out of the recommendations. So if it's saying, for example, behaviour change programs, an example might be that a research evaluation might say that, you know, there's a lot of complexities around housing needs or mental health supports needed, and so, but you're not funded for it, so we need to do some advocacy. Well, having the research that's going to support that advocacy is going to really help us, right? But it's going to be the practitioners and the services that are actually doing that advocacy, that are seeking that funding. It's not going to necessarily be the academic world that's doing that advocacy for us. So to actually be able to get that buy-in from the practitioners from the very get-go around, what do you see as the need? What would help you? What data is going to help you in your advocacy? And let's investigate that together. See if that's actually what's happening, that there is a gap there. And then, you know, we've got some recommendations that you can do something with it. I just think it's going to make it so much more purposeful and meaningful when you're getting people on the ground that's actually going to take this and not just build another journal article with it and another research project. But yeah, you've got someone on the ground that can go, I'm going to use this, and I can actually now put a letter to the government to get more funding around case management support. And I've got the data to show that it's needed.
Thanks, Brodie. And Sky, building on that point from Brodie, I mean, in terms of the different directions that can be set on research right at that commissioning stage, who's setting it up and how that can shape the direction. You've worked in so many different research and evaluation contexts. Really interested in your reflections on the role of practitioners in this work.
Thanks, Tessa. I just want to acknowledge the Jadawurrung peoples whose country I'm working from today. I agree wholeheartedly with all of the points that the panel have already made. I would like to see that there is priority setting by practitioners as experts who are working deeply with communities and people with lived experience. So that would probably be a starting point. And I think commissioning off the back of those priorities is important. I want to see more practitioner-led evaluation. And as someone who runs a consultancy, I want to see less consultants and more practitioners leading. And to your point, Karen, where that's not possible, like genuine, meaningful partnership. Because when we're vulnerable populations, the role that a practitioner plays in trust building and relationship building and keeping stability and care at the forefront through these processes while we research or learn or explore new things, the practitioner is the most important person in that space. So more practitioner-led evaluation, less consultant. And I think we just need the tools and mechanisms to be able to do that. My opinion is that practitioners are probably evaluating programs and interventions all the time. It's like who writes it down and who gets the publication. So I think it's already happening. I think it's about more value around the incidental kind of evaluative research practices that you're already doing. Practitioners really like setting that up to be able to be recognised and valued more broadly.
Thanks, Guy. I just feel like we've got a slightly sticky line with you. We can see you really clearly catching most of what you're saying. But Sky, I think you've brought us really beautifully to a question that we've actually had from our audience, and it reflects part of a discussion that we were having in preparation, which is right to this question about, so how do we do that then? If we've got a really clear sense of why practitioner expertise matters in this work, what does it look like to really enable that? And, you know, the question that's come in is, you know, going straight to that really critical question about how do we resource it? Are we talking about funding mechanisms that really cover the cost of, but even opening up to think about what is that cost and what does that look like in a context where we know we've often got services and practitioners who are already pretty stretched. So I'm going to just invite you really to pop when you're hot in terms of who wants to come in on that initial discussion about how do we do that. Karen.
One of the models I'd point people to is the work that we've been doing in Newcastle that's been led by Yena Thompson, Kelvin Kong, Nathan Towney, Raylene Gordon, myself. You can Google Aboriginal Health Research Strategy Newcastle and it'll come up. And what that does is centre the Aboriginal lived experience at the very front end of research, and it sets up a community panel whereby Aboriginal community members who are health practitioners in their own right are part of a community panel where they're involved in priority setting for what the community wants research into. They're directing where research funding should be allocated. They're consulting with university or institutional based researchers before they even put in a grant application. And not just consulting over the research question, but the research team, the budget, the methodology, everything. And then embedding practitioners and community members into the research team. And then also looking at, well, how is it going to be used? What's the point of all of this research? What is going to come of it? So I think that's a really great model to look at. In addition, I would also say that actually negotiating with practitioners is really important. So often we have university or corporate researchers come to practitioners saying, well, we've got this project, it's already been through ethics, we've got a budget, we really want your participation, it'll probably take, I don't know, 3 to 5 hours, and we've got a $50 Coles voucher. Ouch.
That
the
goes
number of
to the
research.
participant, maybe not the actual practitioner.
Well, that too, and the ouch factor for me comes from the ignorance of the impact of the basics card on Aboriginal communities and how insulting that type of approach is. But also and I think that I don't think until I don't want to sound condescending, but there's a really different commercial set of requirements for private practitioners. So I'm not talking about practitioners who are in a full-time funded role working for a women's legal centre or a community health centre. I'm talking about practitioners in the private sector. We don't have the luxury of a full-time salary that you just build things into and shift priorities around. We are on funding that is tied to hours in the day and clients that you see, and it's a very different commercial model. And so I think really having that conversation with practitioners up front around, well, what would enable your participation, but also what's the driver of your participation. We typically don't have the driver that career success is publishing. So for us, our driver is systems change, because we're walking alongside our clients day in, day out, feeling the frustrations ourselves, often as victim survivors as well, but as practitioners in that system day in, day out. So for us, the reason we engage is because of systems change. So what are you negotiating into this partnership, and actually seeing it as a meeting of equals as opposed to this hierarchical expert mentality that can sometimes be there. And I think that's really key to setting things up for success, and in that, obviously talking about remuneration, 100%. Talking about data sovereignty, talking about ethics and participation, talking about no-go areas is really important. And just the last final point, and the reason I talk about this, kind of coming at it and trying to remove that power imbalance and coming at it from a respectful and equal footing. We've just had research released yesterday for the Centre for Indigenous People and Work that has demonstrated that Indigenous women have a 35% pay gap. 35. And so many Indigenous women work as practitioners. So really, thinking about how when we're working in research, we don't duplicate or make that pay gap worse, because we feel an obligation to say yes when it's going to benefit our community. But yet that pay gap can be worsened through participating in research. So really thinking about the ethics, not just on participants, but also on your partners who should be practitioners.
Thanks, Karen. And I think a number of the panelists have already opened up the lens around what we mean when we're talking about ethics. We're not only talking about the often very narrowly defined and controlled ethics consideration processes, particularly within universities. We're thinking about, ethics as a way of thinking about how we do the research and why that matters, and just hearing a whole range of perspectives from you already across the panel about the power that goes into assumptions that we make about whose expertise is valued and the opportunity and the need really to shift that. Miranda, interested in your own experience of, the terms in which you're able to do research, the costs and the benefits for you in participation.
Look, I just so strongly agree with, all of Karen's points, and particularly, that perspective around, yes, we absolutely have to be moving away from, and I think there is a bit of a movement away from kind of exploitation culture around, expecting practitioners to just participate without a whole lot in return. And so we do need to be, really thinking about how a practitioner is engaged in a relational and reciprocal, genuinely relational and reciprocal way. But for me personally, like what Karen kind of said, beyond anything the ethics of like how I'm then treated, how is my contribution then treated in the process from the point of my participation moving forward. So as an example, there have been experiences of me contributing, quite a significant amount of time and care and energy and thought into pieces of work, and then actually never hearing from anyone ever again. And then sometime in the future, seeing something published. And so kind of no sense of kind of dignity of that contribution and how that's ended up leading to something, for them. But also for me, it's about I've become more careful actually about what I'm contributing to, because there's been times where I've contributed in a way that I felt like I was making my position or perspective quite clear, but then it's been interpreted in a particular way, and sometimes with perhaps a particular agenda in mind. And so that's been ethically painful for me to actually then be like, well, actually my contributions haven't actually ended up being in line with my true perspectives. And that's because I wasn't engaged meaningfully in any sort of sense-making process further along in the trajectory of the research. In terms of kind of like accessibility for practitioners as well, is just thinking about like a lot of what's already been spoken about, but Sky made this beautiful point before around really making sure that we're engaging with practitioners who are embedded with communities, but then also then like that next step backwards from there, how are we embedding research where practitioners are located? So actually, instead of research happening over here and practice happening over here, actually having the praxis of research kind of being brought into the practice context, so that it's not necessarily additional or more work for practitioners. It's actually changing the way that research happens. Instead of expecting more from practitioners, it's actually like bringing the research into the process. And I think that requires probably a bit more of a systems and organisational and structural kind of way of changing the way that research occurs, because it probably needs buy-in at a broader level. But yeah, so those are some of my thoughts, but keen to hear from others too.
Thanks, Miranda. And Brodie, I was going to come to you next, but I just wanted to feed in for the panel a question that comes from one of our participants. And it's really, it's an invitation to you all to talk about where you've seen this being done well. And the questions come in from someone who has deep practice expertise, is now teaching at a university, has resource within their role for research, but isn't able to build that connection with researchers, isn't being drawn on. So it's a great opportunity for us to just hear from the expertise across this panel. Are there examples where you've seen that done well that we can learn from? Brodie, let's come to you next.
So I can understand the question, Jim, of where it's gone well when researchers have been able to connect with practitioners?
Yeah. Exactly that, where we've seen that that reflection of, a lot of the opportunities that you were talking about actually in the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is relational, isn't it? I mean, in terms of my perspective, I came from academia and then went into practice. And so with that, I came into practice now with existing relationships with local universities. And so, when I think that really helped when I would see grant opportunities of going, well, I'll connect with this university and this academic that I know and see if they want to partner on it. And, so some of when it's gone well or easy, it is because those relationships exist. So I think, and they don't happen accidentally. So how do you foster relationships across sectors, in sectors, whether, not all research has to be just one organisation and one university, so how are you building those relationships to make this work well? I think, when it doesn't work well, it's probably because you don't have trusting relationships within that research team and the practitioners and organisations that are involved. So I think, it's so much of it is, I think there is a need for that relationship building. And I'd say that's where it's worked really well from my experience. I think I don't want to go off that question, so I'll let you finish that, but I'll come back to the other point that we were talking about before.
Thanks, Brodie. And Sky, coming back to you, you talked about the importance of the tools that help us do this well. Are there examples that you've seen from your work where you've seen that, that partnership or even that leadership from practitioners in the work? And particularly in that context that you've sort of called out about connected really strongly and directly with the communities that they're working to serve. I think we might have just had a glitch with Sky, so we'll come back to Sky. Let's kind of keep this conversation really focused on the how we engage practitioners. And, you know, a number of you talked about those questions around the ethics. We've also heard from the panel and from questions coming in from our participants about the sustainability issues, partly in the context of, you know, the demands on people's times. So interested, you know, from all of you, how does it look different in the actual doing of the research or the evaluation, depending on whether we're talking about practitioners as participants, or, you know, the different sorts of approaches in terms of co-design, or we've had a question from someone about the cost of recruiting, that practitioners are often tapped for recruiting participants, but without any reflection of the resource that goes into that.
I mean, I think that's the thing. It needs to be funded. You know, we're not funded to do research and evaluation in program contracts. So someone needs to come to the table with some money. Either your organisation is funding a organisation-led research, or it's university or government. I think the challenge is when funding doesn't cover backfill. So, you know, you might be getting your hours, but unless you're able to actually fund backfill, whether it's as a manager or as a practitioner, then it's not actually alleviating any of that capacity issue to actually contribute. So it needs to be meaningful in that way. And I think one of the missing pieces often is the funding and resources to implement recommendations and findings from research. You know, you might be able to have the funding to contribute to a research, and then it's concluded. You've got all these great recommendations, but are we funded to then implement things out of that, like the outcomes that come from it, or even the advocacy piece that can come from it? And that's often a missing piece of the conversation. And it can be a barrier to why you then want to participate. If you're not able to actually do anything with the research because of capacity.
I think also opening up opportunities, I really want to emphasise, I think there's so much more opportunity for practitioner-led research and evaluation, like Sky was saying earlier, rather than just kind of participation or co-design. And so really for there to be much more openness around how that looks like. For instance, like a practitioner leading a piece of research or an evaluation, but not having to go through like it being a PhD, for instance, like, you know, what are the kind of mechanisms that allow for a practitioner to be able to do that without having to be, you know, committed to 6 years of study, you know, so kind of really thinking a bit more adaptively and around what that can look like. And I guess also, and to Brodie's point earlier, you know, thinking about those relationships, and similarly to Brodie, although like I've always been a practitioner role, over time have kind of built some relationships with people in various kind of institutions or that do have the capacity for research. And so I guess just to all those practitioners who are listening to this is, you know, if you have an idea, go and pitch it. Like, you know, if you have an idea, like, and you don't know who to talk to, just start reaching out, because you know, sometimes I think practitioners are about kind of might have ideas about what would be good to know, but it's actually about like this sense of like they haven't been given permission to enter into the conversation. They haven't been given a sense of like empowerment to actually be like, oh, I can do this. I can contribute in this way. And so I guess just an encouragement, and I'll probably need to take my own advice here, to kind of do that, to actually actively reach out and really think about what opportunities there are for you to kind of contribute in your own way as well.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. I might jump on the back of that, and that internet is a little bit dodgy, so I was trying not to talk for long. Emily asked a really cool question in the chat, just about, like, what's needed to support this. And I think there's tools that are out there that are they're really accessible, and they support the principles that Tessa showed early in this conversation about centering voices of people who are most committed to what's happening on the ground. They also talk about using existing data. So I think there's tools there that can help. I know my internet's dodgy, might not have heard half of that. So
Thanks. Thanks, Guy. If I can relay back, and also it might be if you switch off your camera, you might get better sound. What I'm hearing from you is just that reflection that there are tools already there, that we don't need to feel like we need to reinvent the wheel, and just, you know, making sure that people are looking into some of those guidances, often hard lessons learned from the work that's come before, including where we've not got it right. Sky, I hope that was a reasonable reflection of that really important point from you. Yep, thumbs up. Great, thanks. And again, just, you know, opportunity for people to use the chat function or the Q&A if you're participating, to share with us resources if you think there's ones that are worthy of a shout out. Karen, would love to come to you. I'm really interested, you know, just reflecting that point for you about, we're talking about people's time and expertise as a resource, and often we're not providing the resourcing to engage with that. What does it look like for you to be able to engage with research, and when do you feel like you're able to do that in a way that's worthwhile for you and valuable?
It's difficult. I think you know, where's it worthwhile and valuable, where that research is going to translate into action and change. That's where I will prioritize participating. So really, and you know, I think that's what most academics want as well, right? They're hopefully in academia to change the current state of play. So really articulating that. I think there's also a role for, just circling back on that conversation, there's really a role to play from those who commission and pay for research in understanding the actual cost of research. And that's an education piece that I think funders need to be doing themselves, and can certainly seek input from practitioners, academics and other researchers in doing that. But, and, you know, I think that the feedback that I hear, particularly in relation to health research in that Newcastle space that I spoke about, is that by including practitioners and by including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in research as partners, not as those who are being researched, really sets the research apart and is more attractive to those who are funding research, because there's not many people, frankly, that are doing that particularly well. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for researchers, and to the point in the chat around, well, how do you connect if you're, you know, working for an NGO, if you're working in a university, if you're working in private practice, how are we joining these dots? And I think that's one of the problems, is that the sectors are quite segmented. You know, I have, as a lawyer, I have a relationship with a couple of universities and research institutes, but I'm not sure that every lawyer does that. So, you know, how do we invest? How does someone, I don't know who, invest in having that directory, in having that place where we can develop those relationships to then strengthen the research agenda across the country? I think that would be that would be really valuable.
Thanks, Karen. And let's stay with this for a moment. We've got a question from someone who's talking about a proposal from Fair Work Australia, which really prioritises academic qualifications over practitioner expertise and lived experience. So without assuming that everyone here is an expert on industrial law, I'm interested in, where you're seeing the opportunities to really value this expertise in the frameworks for research. So we've talked a bit about the funding, how we resource it, but where have you seen some of those good examples where we're really recognising different forms of expertise as core to the kinds of insight that we need from research or evaluation? Brodie, let's come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think even though you're navigating a hierarchical structure and fitting into it possibly, but I think there is value in being named on the research team, actually getting a publication, and being able to, I think whether you have a PhD or you don't have a PhD, being on a publication and having your affiliation be clear that you're a practitioner is giving further weight that practitioners have expertise, that practitioners can be doing research, that they are part of the research world. Certainly, I think for those that do it, for those that have done it, I think that's a way that it's working well. Versus the other alternative is that you're contributing to co-design of research. You're doing recruitment you're doing potentially interviews, you're doing potentially some data analysis, and you're not involved in any of the publication. And all that is done is saying that we connected with this organisation. So that really doesn't say practitioner, So I think if I had to say that there was a binary way of thinking, being able to get a publication or get your name identified in the research team somewhere is a way that it's done well. I think the challenge that I've experienced is around ethics, the idea, and also, I mean, I think there's this resistance. I mean, coming from criminology, I think is only my frame of reference, but in sociology, but there is resistance in research that I've experienced of researching yourself, researching your own community, and the idea that you can't be objective. And so I think there's a bit of a barrier that we have to overcome there as well. But certainly when it comes to ethics, that's been some of the roadblocks that I've faced in terms of depending on your position within the sector. If you're in a position of power and you might be on someone's recruitment panel one day, then you're not able to be the one that does the interviews, and you can't look at identifiable data. And I think, so I mean, I'm not going to say let's not have an ethics department at a university, but there is certainly gatekeeping that can happen. And there's definitely a conversation we had around who decides what's ethical practice, who decides what's ethical research, and how do we manage, or how can we be trusted to manage our own conflicts of interest? Because we do it all the time. We manage conflicts and we know how to do ethical practice in our work. But we don't have our own way of getting ethics application, like ethics approved, unless we partner with a university, and then we're excluded sometimes in what role we can play as researchers, and so I think there's a big barrier there as well.
Thanks, Brodie. I think that reminded that there are still some deeply held assumptions about independence and rigour that really work against a lot of what you've all been talking about in terms of the importance of connection and the relational ways of working that are so core to respectful, ethical and nuanced research. I just think that's a really welcome reminder, and I'll in a moment to see if anyone else has a kind of contribution around that. But I was listening to the chair of a major research funder, a global research funder recently, just actually offering that challenge that still often in the governance and decision making around research, we hold these really strong boundaries around independence, and those boundaries get in the way of the connections to community, or in this conversation, practitioner expertise, which is the expertise that we need for the research to really make a difference. Just interested across the panel whether any of you have anything else to sort of bring into that conversation as we think about where we're really challenging some of the orthodoxies in how research is done, particularly if we're talking about research to drive change. Karen.
I think from an Aboriginal perspective, from the learning that I've had culturally, the concept of this pure, independent person is something that kind of cuts across a little bit, that actually, when you've got a system and a society and a community that is interconnected, that we are woven together. We are woven together with our connection to country. We're woven together with our connection and relationships to others. That it really is, I think, a quite a colonialist and patriarchal construct of this independent, unbiased person. And I mean, I certainly get it in the legal profession, that, well, how can you be, a lawyer representing, when you're a lawyer representing sexual violence victims, how can you be impartial? And you think, well, do I need to be impartial? Actually, I'm there to represent the needs of my clients, and my clients are victim survivors. So it's this funny construct of impartiality and this pure, unbiased person. We all come with biases. We all come with relationships. And we all, so many of us work in fields. I mean, for me, speaking as a lawyer, where we have very strict legal and professional obligations around managing conflicts of interest. And I would suggest potentially stricter than other segments of our society. So they're funny, notions, I think, and I think it cuts both ways. You'll hear from practitioners, what does that sector know about such and such? We live and breathe it and walk alongside our clients day in, day out. What would they know? So you get some of those perspectives in across all of these different silos, and they're not helpful. They're ultimately, we want to be building respectful and constructive relationships that are for the benefit of research to change the status quo. That's what we're all on about. So how do we, leave those misconceptions? I'd say they're misconceptions, and be collaborating really constructively to change the landscape for victims, survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. I mean, it's a massive problem. We've got to get over ourselves, right?
Thanks, Karen. Just going to take a moment. We're into the last 10 minutes of this terrific webinar. And I just want to remind our participants, you can use the Q&A function in the webinar app to send in your questions directly. Also, just want to let our panelists know there's a lot of love coming through the chat for all of you and for the insights that you've been sharing. But can we just stay with this where you've just sort of taken us, Karen, particularly thinking about respectful relationships. And I think you're also in some ways talking about accountability. And one thing we haven't talked about yet in this discussion is the role of Indigenous data sovereignty and what it takes to understand and ensure that we're well informed by, and committed to Indigenous data sovereignty. So just wanted to start, Karen, with you or Sky, to see whether either of you just want to share some reflections about the importance of that in the context of the discussion we're having.
Sorry, it's the internet. I think that Indigenous sovereignty is critically important at every stage of research and evaluation, as well as program design, conceptualization. So it intersects all of those parts. So how we about Indigenous data sovereignty in our practice at COA is caring for data and information, so that data and information can care for country and community. So collecting the right information the right way from the right people, so that information can be used to change programs, like shift where resources are being allocated, to the needs of people who are experiencing or using violence. So really thinking about how the whole relationship and cycle works, and that also extends in like the way that you did before, Karen, about valuing people's insights, really paying for contribution from people, for caring for people through that process, holding the right space and creating safety. So I think there's a whole different way that we go about doing those things, but it's something that needs to be considered every single step of the way.
I think asking is the first and most valuable thing someone can do. It's really, working in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners, communities, participants, researchers, and having that open discussion around, well, what does data sovereignty mean? Different communities will have different interpretations, I'd also say. You've got the IATSA standards, which are exceptional as a first point of call. So if you're not familiar with them, get familiar would be my advice. But asking, what does it mean for you? What do you want done here? And also, I think working, in the victim survivor space of how can researchers constantly be giving back, because it is so much depletion and, pulling from victim survivors and the practitioners that work with them. How can researchers be saying, hey, is there something we can do here that would benefit? Would you love a transcript of your interview, so that you don't have to keep repeating what you're saying, because we're asking you the same stuff that probably a journalist will ask you, or someone from another research institute, or a police officer, or a this or a that. So how can you be really lightening the load through sharing that data? The other reflection is making sure that we're not pitting communities against each other. So when we're publishing or sharing data, how are we making sure that communities aren't feeling judged or competing? And again, it comes back to asking and being led on that point.
Thanks, Karen. And I just want to note for everyone that the National Research Agenda suggests one way we can supplement practitioners' roles in research is for extra funding for them. So just making sure that we've got it in those frameworks that we hope are really guiding the work ahead, and recognising that's not only the research being done, but how it's funded or commissioned, which I think is such a clear insight that's come from all of you. We're getting close to wrapping up, so I'm really going to invite each of you to give not even a minute, less than a minute, but just an opportunity to share a clear example that you want people to be left with in terms of where you think you've seen this done well. And this is obviously the combination of centering practitioner expertise, but a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of those relational ways of working and that deep commitment to the ethics of the research and the nuance in terms of different perspectives being heard. Are there any final reflections from anyone just to really share with our audience examples where you've seen that done well?
Yeah, I'd like to just add where I've seen it's done really well is when there is space and autonomy for practitioners or the service to be able to really highlight the safety concerns of publishing research, if there is any. So be able to have that autonomy over data, and the victim survivors, particularly their lived experience being publicly known, and especially if the person using violence knows that they were receiving a service from that organisation. So yeah, I think it's done really well when practitioners have a voice and autonomy over what is done with the findings and how publicly accessible they are. When that's taken into consideration, I think plays a big role.
Thanks, Brodie. Anything else from our brilliant panel? Miranda?
Oh, one example, well, there's a few examples that come to my mind, and kind of some of the shared experiences across those is really where that research has been practitioner-led, and then it's been collaborative across a variety of practitioners and community members as well. And there's been a lot of thought being put into the research questions so that the end result will allow for a very clear way of describing some of the micro elements of practice, because what we so often see in research, even practice-based research, is that there's kind of broad statements about what can be done in practice, but practitioners tend to be left with, well, but what does that actually look like? What's the particular skill, or what's the particular part that is actually the mechanism of change that makes the difference? And so being able to really kind of be very kind of specific around those micro elements so that it's much more easy to translate into day-to-day practice.
Thanks, Miranda. Well, I'm going to end us on that note because we're right at time. I think we could continue exploring these issues, but what's been so clear from our panellists is that role of practice expertise really in the context of research and evaluation to drive change, and that given, you know, for an organisation like ANRO's where our role is to support evidence to drive change, and the role of the National Research Agenda as a tool and a framework to avoid duplication and really ensure that all of the evidence and the time we're spending in gathering it is going to be useful, that centering practitioner expertise as one of the really key forms of input in that research is absolutely vital to the value of the work. Huge thank you to our panellists, to Karen Isles, to Skye Trudgett, to Miranda Moir, to Brodie Evans. Thank you to participants and the questions that are coming through. We'll be sending you a feedback survey. We'd love your input in terms of how we continue to shape these webinars to be really useful. And we'll hope you can join us for the next ANRO webinar on Tuesday, the 30th of September, a webinar that you can register for online, and we'll be sending reminders out for that shortly. Thanks everyone for joining us today.